Hi, it's Eric Martin. So, I'm sure you've run into this situation before. You arrive in a new organization, or you get a new job, a new role, and someone says to you, "So here's your work." And you say, "Well, thank you very much." And then you start doing this work and realize maybe 3 months later, maybe 3 years later, maybe a whole career later, that it was the wrong work. Here you put all this time and energy into doing a piece of work that was defined for you, but didn't really receive the results that you thought were possible. So today we want to talk a little bit about the difference between technical work and adaptive work, or technical problems and adaptive problems. The point here is there's a gap between where you are, your current reality, and what you know is possible. So one way to think about how to close that gap is to divide the work into technical components and adaptive components. Let me talk a little bit about an example of a technical challenge or a technical problem. Take a broken arm. A broken arm has a very clear problem, right? And there's a known solution, a best practice for that kind of problem, which is to go to a doctor. Technical work is like that. There's a clear problem and a clear solution. And oftentimes it's the responsibility of the expert, the person in charge, the authority, to solve that problem for you. My guess is that you have some technical expertise, and that's a good thing. Most of the work in organizations is technical. So the challenge becomes when we run into a situation where the work, the challenge that we're facing is different than what we have a skill set or repertoire to address. Here's an example from my own personal life. This has to do with my father, who was a firefighter. Now, of course, the technical work of a firefighter is putting out fires. They do this on a day-to-day basis, and the work there is one of efficiency. Well, one year my father came home from work and told me that community residents were actually throwing rocks at the firefighters. The next summer, those rocks turned into bullets. So you can see immediately the challenge that he faced. It wasn't a technical challenge. It wasn't simply a matter of putting the fire out faster. It involved what we think of as adaptive work. Now, the adaptive challenges had a lot to do with the relationship between the firefighters and the community. And the work required to repair that relationship was beyond the skill set of what a typical firefighter might have been trained to do. But it was necessary in order to get the technical work done. One of the biggest wastes of time and resource in organizational life is putting a technical fix on an adaptive challenge. Now, why do we do that? Well, it feels good. It feels good to put out those fires in organizational life. Oftentimes, it's something we feel good doing because it's a skill set that we know how to deliver on. Now, there's nothing wrong with technical work when applied to technical problems. The challenge becomes when you apply it to an adaptive problem. And an adaptive problem is difficult, partly because sometimes the problem's clear, but the solution is not clear. Or, in some cases, the solution is clear and the problem is unclear as well. So the work there is not one of efficiency. It's not one of delegation. It's often not work that resides with a single expert or an authority figure. You have to approach the work as mobilizing other stakeholders to engage in a process of learning new skill sets, learning how to relate to people differently, learning how to deploy resources differently. And it also involves loss. Now, one of the fallacies, one of the biggest myths is that people resist change. It's actually not true. People don't resist change per se. What they resist is loss. The idea that they have to give something up that's important to them. A relationship, a skill that they've honed over many years, autonomy, resources, power, these are all different forms of loss. So one of the most important questions we can ask when leading adaptive change is, what is the loss that people would have to experience in the service of progress? Now, that's a counterintuitive idea. Most of us approach change saying, what's the gain? What's the win-win? And while there may be a gain years down the road, in the moment at least, it feels like a loss to some of the folks involved. That's why they resist. So these challenges, these technical and adaptive challenges, they don't come neatly bundled. You don't have a technical problem sitting over here and an adaptive challenge sitting over here. Oftentimes they come mixed. To use my father's example again, he still had to put out fires most of the time on a day-to-day basis, but he had to begin to shift his resource and his attention and that of his fellow firefighters to this community building work. So as you think about the challenge that you face, what are the technical components, the things that you know how to do very well, you've probably been doing for a long time, that are supported by the system, the organization that you work in, and that are actually making progress? Knowing what those things are, investing in those things, doing more of those things is important work. But also consider, where's the learning that has to happen? What new skills, what new ways of working do you need to embrace and others need to embrace around you? Learning that happens, what we say, below the neck, in your heart and your gut, as you think about maybe even your sense of professional identity in the work that you do and why you do it. So I'd ask you to think, as you think about the challenge that you're working on, your adaptive challenge. First of all, where is the loss showing up? What kind of learning is needed? And are you deeply connected to the purpose that you're trying to serve?